To those who have, more will be given. It's all about, to those who have held on to responsibility, I will give more responsibility. You'll get a promotion and get more work to do. No more money, but more work to do, and I'll give you a new title. Notice another thing. Those who have not, it'll be taken away. Those who have not done their responsibility, it'll go away. This is about living in between. Are you doing the work of the Christian? Are you living as you should, as a community, as a church, as individuals? It'll be taken away from you if you're not. Now notice the difference. We've got a third character in the middle. The one that got 5 talents, the 2 talents, and the 1 talent. How does the story present the one who took the 2 talents and made it into 4? Absolutely. So this is not a place where we go, okay, everybody should strive to have 5 talents or, be the top of the heap. No. We have different abilities. The question is not whether you are measured up according to someone else's standard of work. It is whether you are using your full abilities for the reign of God. So just because you are only able to be in charge of 2 makes you no less faithful. Good and faithful servant. As long as you are faithful with what responsibility has been given to you. Now let's use that during a stewardship drive and quit talking about money and talk about responsibility instead. I'll come hear that sermon. There are different Greek words. And usually in the English when we use servant, and I did it out of habit a second ago, it is when we try and tone down the slave language, to be honest, because we're uncomfortable with it. For darn good reason, right? I mean, the history of slavery in our country, but also in the ancient world, slavery's always been a horrible thing. But there were servants who would have been either paid servants or might be indentured servants, for instance, a short time while they're paying off a debt, things like that. So there could be different levels. So there can be a distinction between the Greek word for servant and the Greek word for slave, but usually in the translations it's slave. For instance, and when Paul says slave of Christ, he means to be using offensive language. He wants it to be striking as to what kind of subordination it is to the will of God we're talking about here. So it's not that some people try and say, well, slavery wasn't really as bad back then as it was, say, in the 19th century America. Well, tell that to the slaves back then. You were owned people. Usually in the ancient world, slaves came to you either through conquest of another nation or through inheritance, so a slave born to a slave is yours, those kinds of things. But that's really the main translation thing. It's almost always slave. Let's look at the last parable. How are we doing time? We're doing good. When the Son of Man comes in glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his throne in glory. You all know this parable. You love this parable. Or I should say that in past tense. Because once we talk about it, you're not going to love it as much. Because I'm going to tell you what you've heard is wrong. Because remember, that's the way biblical scholars make our money. We say everybody else got it wrong. So I know you can have somebody come here next time and they'll say I'm wrong. But remember, they're wrong. I'm right. Okay, so come here. Tell me, sheep and the goats, tell me what this means, what you've always heard this. Okay, so that's behind it. But in the story, the goats are bad because they don't do this work. They don't feed the poor. They don't clothe the naked, etc. So when a preacher tells this, then what do they tell you should do? What should you do based on this parable? Come on. Feed the poor. You want to be a sheep. Nobody wants to be a goat. Those on my right and my left. Okay, so let's read this differently, though. Notice how this parable like the other, follows some similar structures. There's repetition, just like the other. So we go through the sheep and through the goats in very similar language, just like we went through the ones with talents in very similar language. So there's a lot of parallels, but there are things that are different too. So this is our third major parable here. And remember, storytellers like sets of three. So the 3 pigs, the 3 bears we were just talking about, it's not new. Think about the story of the prodigal son. But let's back up to it. This is in Luke, not in Matthew. But that series starts with the parable of the lost sheep. How's that one go? Okay, what a stupid shepherd. Who leaves 99% of your inventory to go find 1%, right? So there's a twist there, but goes and finds the one foolishly, but then there's a big celebration. Come, celebrate, we found the sheep, da da da. Next is the story of the woman and the lost coin. What does she do? Tosses the house, sweeps everything out, finds the coin. When she finds the coin, what does she do? That is the stupidest thing in the world. I've lost my money, I've lost my money, I found my money, let's spend my money and have a party. Right? Okay, but we've got the same structure. Something is lost, something is found, there is celebration. Then we get the same structure in the prodigal son. The younger son says to dad, I'd like my inheritance now, which is like saying, I'd like to go in and consider you to be dead, if you don't mind, so that I can take my money and go make my way in the world. So he takes his inheritance, which would probably be 1/3 of his father's possessions, because the elder son gets twice as much as all the younger sons. So the younger son takes his money. We often blame him as squandering it. That's not completely true. They're not stories of parties and casinos and the thing. Instead, there's a famine. He loses his money. Gets so bad he has to feed the pigs. And he says to himself, even the slaves, there's that slave thing, even the slaves in my father's house have it better. I will go back and be a slave. So he goes home. He is lost. He comes home, the father sees him, doesn't consider him a slave, brings out the robe, gives him a ring, throws him a party. We get the celebration. We have the exact same structure, only Luke is not finished. The elder son's out working in the field, faithful. Hears this going on, comes in and says, what the heck? You never even let me have a little scrawny goat for a party with my friends, and he comes back after considering you dead, and you give him the fatted calf. And the father says, nothing that's yours is going to be taken away from you, but my son who was lost has been found. Come to the celebration. How does the story end? Does he come in or not? No? We don't know, actually. It just stops. Just stops. So the implication is we are to identify with the elder son, and we have the choice. Are we going to celebrate, or are we going to stay outside and fume? But notice what I'm setting up is the structure. So we have 2 parallel structures of parables, and then the third one follows that and then breaks it in a way that makes you go, oh, catches you. That's what Matthew does here. So we have these 2 structures, the structure of these 2 parables that are laying out already not yet kinds of situations where you'll get more responsibility. The faithful get more responsibility, the unfaithful are taken away, right? Is the main thing. We're retold over and over. But then we get some new things. So who is the main character of this parable? Does it say shepherd? Who comes? The Son of Man, the Son of the human, who's the king. Notice Matthew has had Jesus talking about the Son of Man, the Son of the human, over and over and over again as referring to himself, right? Suddenly we have a parable where Jesus makes himself the main character of the story. My daughter used to, when I put her to bed when she was small, say, tell me a story. So I'd start telling Little Red Riding Hood or something. No. Tell me a story about me. right? You know, so she wanted a fictional story where she was the main character. And so how would I begin my fairy tale about my daughter? Okay, so you know the exact structures. You can implicitly make the story, and how are you going to end it? She lived happily ever after. You know, my daughter's not going to get it in a story I tell. You know, she's going to be the victor and whatever. Well, so we have taken a twist here. Jesus puts himself as the main character in a parable. That is striking. So that sets us up from the beginning to wonder what else is going on in this story that's different. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him. All right, so what is that word, nations? In Greek, it is ethnoi. It's the root of English words like ethnic, right? Nations. It is the same word translated as Gentiles. Translators get to decide, when am I going to make it Gentiles and when am I going to make it nations? But in Greek, it would always be the same word. In English, we change it. So this becomes different. If we don't hear it as the Son of Man gathered all the nations, and instead, the Son of Man gathered all the Gentiles together. Now, let's talk a little bit more about this word, because this is a complex word in Matthew's day. Ethnoi can be, remember we said every word makes a difference in terms of what it's in contrast to. So woman can mean female over against a male, or it can mean adult over against a child. Ethnoi, Gentile, can mean non-Jewish, which is the way we mainly think of it, when it is expressed against Jews specifically. But in the early church, it was also used to distinguish Christians from outsiders. So there are times when the same author can use the term in different ways. In this setting, it means non-Jew. Over here, it means non-Christian. I think in the first two parables we've been looking at, Jesus has been talking, Matthew's presented Jesus as talking about inside the church, right? So inside the church, are you faithful or not? And suddenly now, we've shifted to the elder brother, if you will. Now we're talking about those outside the church. That's not a way you've ever heard this preached. All the Gentiles, all the non-Christians will be gathered before him, and he will separate people from one from another as a shepherd separates. That's funny. As a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep at his right. Aren't you glad to be sat over here now? And the goats on the left. I don't know what it means about you. Maybe you're the angels. And the king will say to those at the right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous, so you're righteous, the righteous will answer, "Lord, when was it we saw you hungry, gave you food, thirsty, gave you something to drink?" There's that repetition, good ancient storytelling. "When was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? When was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer, I'll tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family." Okay, here's a translation problem. The NRSV has tried to be more inclusive, and it's right. Literally, in Greek, it is those who are my brothers. Some places, the NRSV updates that language to say brothers and sisters, which is what I wish they did, because I think that's what's really meant. But members of my family is really those who are my brothers, literally. You did it to me. Okay, so now we got to pause. So I'm saying, you fed me. You Gentiles. You fed me, you clothed me, you visited me in prison, and you say, when did we do that, Lord? And I said, when you did it to the least of these of my brothers. Who are we talking about there? Who are the least of these of my brothers? That would be a great guess, and it makes good sense. I mean, that's the way this is usually read in some ways. But Matthew actually is coded language for Matthew. It's the Christians. Over and over in different places throughout Matthew, if you did a concordance work, you would see brothers is always language for inside the church. And even least of these is specifically those most vulnerable in the church. Often the newbies in the faith, that kind of thing. But, so notice what we just got described. You get a reward from me because you outside the church treated the church well. Now you goats. All right, so let's look at this language. It comes up again. Same pattern. Then he'll say to those at his left hand, you that are accursed, depart from me, sent away. So you are left behind, you are sent away. Depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. So remember, the devil is not, as we think about it, you know, often in our sort of current day mythology, it's the one opposed, the chief evil one. For I was hungry, you gave me no food. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, you didn't welcome me. Naked, you didn't give me clothing. Sick and in prison, you didn't visit me. Y'all are terrible people. And then they also will answer, Lord, when was it we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you? And he'll answer them, truly, I tell you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these. There's that language again. You did not do it to me. And these will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. All right, what do you make of this parable about Gentiles and the way they treat the church? Suddenly, it is not the way we usually hear it, and you preach it, you've heard it preached, where we want you to identify with the sheep, right? So I want you to be more like the sheep. But no, your place in this parable is with the naked and the hungry. You are the one in prison and sick. You are the least of these of my brothers. So your place is not about doing good to others. There's plenty of places the Bible talks about that, right? I'm not taking that away. But here, this is something else. So what do you make of this? How does this talking about eschatological existence? For Matthew, all will be judged. And you don't have to come down to the altar rail to be Christian, to be saved, to be left behind and part of the righteous. If you are doing the same kind of eschatological ethic he wants the church doing, which he does want us feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, going to prisons and everything. If you're doing that, you're already living out the already not yet. You are dissatisfied with the way the world is, and you are living out of your abundance to make it better. In a day right now where we are talking so much about refugees and not letting in Muslims and maybe preferencing Christians and all that kind of stuff, this is a different word. This isn't us and them in some way of dividing line. This says us plus them. If others share our work, why in the world would we put a border between us and them? So in this sense, this is a way at the end of, this is the elder brother kind of shift that catches us off guard and says to the church in Matthew's day, remember the ancient world was very pluralistic, like we've become more. So in your grandparents' day, we could talk about this being a Christian society in ways we can't talk anymore. We are more like the early church now, where lots of religions are competing in the marketplace. People take from here and there and create new, so you got New Age and Christianity, and I like this little Buddhist idea, so I'm a Christian who believes in reincarnation, so all that kind of stuff. That was back in the ancient world just as much. Matthew is less concerned here with a creed. Can you say the Apostles' Creed? That's what it takes to get into the... No. Are you visiting the poor? Then whether you're in the church or not, there you are. You're in the sheep. So the question is, am I saying that the Dalai Lama, Gandhi, etc., are doing the work of the church and the Lord? And the answer is yes. But you also said, they will be saved. Now that's the language here. But remember, I'm saying this is metaphorical. I'm saying they are living out the salvation already, is what's implied. It's not about, will I get it? Will I get in? It's about, have you already got it? And you know how you've got it? Is when you're doing those kind of things. Those are the kinds of things Christians are doing. They're visiting the sick. They're going to the prisons. They're feeding the naked. And others who are doing that are living the same kind of ethic we are. And that is, we often think of this as a demand. Matthew presents Jesus as seeing it as a gift. Gosh, other people are forced to hate their enemies. We get to love ours. That isn't a horrible thing. That's a great thing. We aren't consumed by hate. We're consumed by love. What a wonderful gift. We are freed from the bondage of hating other people. We get to love our enemies. We don't get to be bound. We don't have to be bound by our possessions. We get to overcome structures that make a difference in people's lives. That's a great gift. If others are celebrating that gift as well and living out that gift, who are we to say, not good enough? So Jesus puts himself into this very parable that says, Gentiles, those outside the church, are living the eschatological existence if they do this. So remember, that may not be saying everything about the quality of existence, may not be saying everything about relationship with God, or something. It's just talking about this one category of already not yet. Matthew clearly wants more people in the church. The Great Commission ends by go forth and make disciples of all the, what's that word? What's that word? Ethnoi, of all the Gentiles. Because in Matthew 10, when he sends out the apostles and says, go preach, the kingdom of God is at hand. He says, go nowhere among the Gentiles. Don't go among the Samaritans. Go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So in the narrative world, the mission is only to Jews. For Matthew, then after the resurrection, it's now extended to the Gentiles. So we get that same ethnoi word repeated here. So Matthew cares about ethnoi coming into the church. So I don't want to make it sound like he doesn't. But in spite of that, that's not all that it is. If they don't come into the church, but they're still living righteously, they are still living righteously. And we can celebrate that and recognize that God honors that. So, eschatological existence here, we're going to go to the parables discourse next, but we see this already not yet is heightened into a point that this is what you get if you're Christian, if you're part of the church, or Gentiles living out this life, is you get more responsibility. Yay! That is a good thing. I think that's right. Now, we should be careful and not raise up the level of persecution too high here. The kinds of persecution we often hear about, the martyrdom stuff, really comes next century. But there certainly is still persecution here, ostracism, these kinds of things. I mean, Jesus, says, I didn't come to make everything nice. There's going to be divisions in family, swords, etc. In other words, I'm going to create some strife, new family lines. So Nero's around 60, but it wasn't that long of a period that he was doing it, and that was only in Rome. We get empire-wide persecution later. So there's been a lot of rethinking of just how much persecution there was in that first century. So yes, there was some. And clearly we talk about being taken before governors and that kind of stuff. There is. It's just not as much as We're going to come back in a little bit and we will talk about the parables discourse next and the way it's eschatological as well.